Did the women proclaim the resurrection or remain silent, reconciling the accounts of Matthew and Mark? The question of whether the women who visited Jesus' tomb ran to proclaim his resurrection or remained silent arises from a comparison between two passages, Matthew chapter 28 verse 8 and Mark chapter 16 verse 8. At first glance, these accounts seem to tell different stories. Did the women run and announce the good news, as Matthew suggests, or did they flee in fear and tell no one, as Mark seems to indicate? Let's explore the details and context of these passages to understand how they fit together, and ultimately, how they enrich our understanding of the resurrection account. First, let's look at the two key verses, Matthew chapter 28 verse 8. And they departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy, and did run to bring his disciples word. And then, Mark chapter 16 verse 8, and they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. At first glance, these passages appear contradictory. Matthew reports that the women, filled with both fear and joy, ran to tell the disciples the good news of the empty tomb and the angel's proclamation of Jesus' resurrection. Mark, on the other hand, states that the women fled from the tomb in trembling amazement and in fear told no one. How can both accounts be true? The key to understanding this apparent discrepancy lies in the context and intended audience of their actions. Both Matthew and Mark agree that the women were fearful when they left the tomb, but their fear was not the fear of terror. It was a mixture of awe and reverence at the miraculous events they had just witnessed. This fear did not paralyze them, it propelled them into action. In Matthew's account, the women are described as running to tell the disciples. There's no contradiction here with Mark's description of their rapid departure, as Mark emphasizes that they fled the tomb in amazement. Both accounts imply urgency in their movement, which is consistent with the overwhelming nature of the experience. The more significant question concerns whether the women proclaimed the resurrection to anyone. Matthew makes it clear that they did indeed go to tell the disciples. The angel instructed them to go quickly and tell his disciples, Matthew 28:7, and they obeyed, running to deliver the message. Luke confirms this by recounting that the women returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Luke 24:9. Mark, however, says neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. Does this mean that the women disobeyed the angel's command and kept the resurrection to themselves? Not at all. The best explanation lies in understanding the scope of their silence. Mark's statement that the women didn't say anything to any man refers to their silence toward the general public. In other words, they did not stop along the way to speak with strangers or other individuals they might have encountered. Their mission was specific to tell the disciples and no one else at that moment. The women's focus was on reaching the apostles, and Mark is emphasizing that they didn't deviate from this task or proclaim the news to anyone else before reaching the disciples. This understanding aligns with the broader context of the resurrection narrative. The angel instructed the women to tell the disciples, and specifically Peter, according to Mark 16:7, that Jesus had risen and that he would meet them in Galilee. Their proclamation was not intended for the general public at this point. Jesus' resurrection would later be proclaimed widely by the apostles and other believers, but the immediate task of the women was to deliver the message to those closest to Jesus. Mark's phrase, neither said they anything to any man, simply indicates that the women did not announce the resurrection to anyone outside of the disciples. The women were faithful to their directive, and Mark's account underscores the urgency and priority of delivering the news to Jesus' inner circle first. When we consider the cultural and literary context of the Gospels, we can see that there's no contradiction between Matthew and Mark. Each writer emphasizes different aspects of the same event. Matthew focuses on the joyful obedience of the women as they ran to tell the disciples, while Mark highlights their awe and trembling, along with their silence toward the general public. Both accounts are complementary, not contradictory. To further support this, Luke 24:10-11 tells us that the women did indeed deliver the message to the apostles, though their words were initially met with skepticism. Their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. Despite the apostles' initial doubt, the message was delivered as the angel had commanded. Beyond resolving this supposed discrepancy, these passages offer a larger spiritual lesson. The women who first witnessed the empty tomb and the angelic announcement responded with a mixture of fear and joy, emotions we can all relate to when faced with the miraculous or the divine. Their fear didn't prevent them from obeying the angel's command, but it did cause them to handle the news with reverence. They understood the gravity of what they had witnessed and knew that this message was not to be taken lightly. The Gospel writers highlight different aspects of their experience to teach us valuable lessons. Matthew shows us their obedience and eagerness to proclaim the good news to the disciples, while Mark reminds us that awe and fear are natural responses to encountering the power of God. Both fear and joy play a role in our relationship with God. They remind us of His holiness and our own responsibility to approach Him with reverence. In conclusion, there is no contradiction between Matthew's and Mark's accounts of the women at the empty tomb. Both passages emphasize different aspects of the same event. The women ran with urgency to tell the disciples, as Matthew describes, but along the way they didn't proclaim the news to anyone else, as Mark notes. Their silence was temporary and selective, reserved for others they might have encountered before reaching the apostles. The resurrection of Jesus was, and still is, the greatest news the world has ever heard. The first witnesses of this event, the women at the tomb, fulfilled their role with faithfulness and reverence, delivering the message to those whom Jesus had chosen to carry it to the world. This reconciliation of the accounts teaches us to approach God's word with patience and a desire to understand, recognizing that what may seem like a contradiction at first often holds deeper meaning when viewed in its proper context.